Joe was one of those people who loved the sound of their own voice. He never had anything interesting to say, but he talked and talked and talked, and every story he told reminded him of another one, so that he never stopped for a second to let anybody else say anything. One evening he was invited to a party by someone whom he had met only a few days before and who did not know him very well yet. They had a good meal and then they had some music and dancing. Joe danced once with a pretty girl and then suggested that they should sit and talk. He talked and talked and talked and was just beginning. And that reminds me of the time. When the girl said the time, yes, you're quite right. She looked at her watch quickly and said, look how late it is. I must go. Matthew Hobbs was 16 years old. He had been at the same school for 5 years, and he had always been a very bad pupil. He was lazy, he fought with other pupils, he was rude to the teachers, and he did not obey the rules of the school. His headmaster tried to make him work and behave better, but he was never successful, and the worst thing was that as Matthew grew older, he was a bad influence on the younger boys. Then at last Matthew left school. He tried to get a job with a big company, and the manager wrote to the headmaster to find out what he could say about Matthew. The headmaster wanted to be honest, but he also did not want to be too hard. So he wrote, if you can get Matthew Hobbs to work for you, you will be very lucky. Henry was from the United States and he had come to London for a holiday. One day he was not feeling well, so he went to the clerk at the desk of his hotel and said, I want to see a doctor. Can you give me the name of a good one? The clerk looked in a book and then said, Dr. Kenneth Gray, 61010. Henry said, thank you very much. Is he expensive? Well, the clerk answered, he always charges his patients £2 for their first visit to him, and £1.50 for later visits. Henry decided to save 50p, so when he went to see the doctor, he said, I've come again, doctor. For a few seconds, the doctor looked at his face carefully without saying anything. Then he nodded and said, oh, yes. He examined him and then said, everything's going as it should do. Just continue with the medicine I gave you last time. Mr. Gray was the manager of a small office in London. He lived in the country and came up to work by train. He liked walking from the station to his office, unless it was raining, because it saved him some exercise. One morning, he was walking along the street when a stranger stopped him and said to him, you may not remember me, sir, but 7 years ago I came to London without a penny in my pockets. I stopped you in this street and asked you to lend me some money. And you lent me £5 because you said that you were willing to take a chance so as to give a man a start on the road to success. Mr. Gray thought for a few moments and then said, yes, I remember you. Go on with your story. Well, answered the stranger, are you still willing to take a chance? Sir Jones bought some things from a big shop last month, and when he got the bill a few days ago, he thought that there was a mistake in it. So he telephoned the shop and asked to speak to the accounts department. Who do you want to speak to in the accounts department? The telephone operator asked. It doesn't matter to me, Mr. Jones answered. He did not know the names of any of the people who worked there. He heard nothing for a few seconds, and then the operator said, "Hello, you wanted to speak to someone in the accounts department, didn't you?" "Yes, that's right," Mr. Jones answered. "Would you like to speak to Mr. Hankinson?" The operator said. "Yes, that'll be all right," Mr. Jones said patiently. "It doesn't matter who I speak to." "I'm sorry," the operator answered, "but Mr. Hankinson isn't in today." A long time ago, when airplanes were not very big or strong yet, all passengers had to be weighed with their luggage so that airplanes did not have to carry more than it was safe to carry. Then later, when airplanes became bigger and stronger, only the luggage had to be weighed, and now very often the luggage has to be measured instead of being weighed, because size is more important to the airlines than weight. Airplanes are so big and strong now that they can carry almost any weight. But before a passenger can travel by Hawaiian Airlines, he or she still has to be weighed. Once, when one fat man was asked by the airline's clerk how much he weighed, he thought for a few seconds and then said to her, "With or without my clothes?" "Well, sir," the girl answered. "How are you planning to travel?" Mary's mother was nearly 70, and Mary and her husband wanted to give the old lady a nice birthday present. She liked drinking tea, so Mary ordered an electric machine which made the tea and then woke you up in the morning. She wrapped it up in the pretty paper and brought it to her mother on her birthday. Then her mother opened the package. Mary showed her how to use it. "Before you go to bed, put the tea in the pot and the water in the kettle," she explained to the old lady, "and don't forget to switch the electricity on. Then when you wake up in the morning, your tea will be ready." After a few days, Mary's mother rang up and said, "Perhaps I'm being rather silly, but there is one thing I'm confused about. Why do I have to go to bed to make the tea?" Mrs. Watson was a doctor's wife. She had a nice neighbor, Mrs. Potts. They often did each other's shopping. One day, Mrs. Potts had to go to Dr. Watson because she was ill. So Mrs. Watson said, "I'll do your shopping today, Burl." Mrs. Potts told her that she only wanted a sheep's kidney. Mrs. Watson went to the shop, and when she came back, she went to Mrs. Potts' house. But she was not there, so she went to her own house. She looked in her husband's waiting room, but Mrs. Potts was not there either. So she went into her husband's office. Her husband told her that Mrs. Potts had just left him and gone to the lavatory. Mrs. Watson ran out into the crowded waiting room just in time to catch Mrs. Potts. She shouted, "Here's your kidney," and ran and gave her the parcel. Peter was 10 years old, and he was having painting lessons every week at this small private class. During the Christmas holidays, he had a party at his home, and he wanted to invite one of the other students, but he only knew her name, Silla Poe. He did not know her address or her telephone number. Peter's mother looked in the telephone book and said, "Well, there are only 4 Poes there." So I telephoned each of them and asked whether they have a daughter who has painting lessons. She telephoned the first one, and the telephone rang for a rather long time before a woman answered. Peter's mother said, "Excuse me, is that the Mrs. Poe who has a daughter who takes painting lessons?" "No, it isn't," the woman answered. "This is the Mrs. Poe who had to get out of her bath to answer the telephone." There is a prison in Iceland which allows its prisoners to go out without any guards to work every day. They work on the farms near their prison during the day and come back to have their evening meal and to sleep every evening. Before they are allowed to go out like this, they have to promise to come back every evening. If they do not promise this, they are not let out. One night, one of the prisoners was invited to have a meal and a drink with the family of the farmer he was working for. So he came back to the prison very late. He had to knock at the gate several times before the guard came to let him in. The guard did not like being disturbed at this time. So he said to the prison angrily, "If you come back so late again, I won't let you in." Mrs. Jenkins was the owner of the small restaurant in Southampton. Southampton is a big port. Mrs. Jenkins had 2 young waitresses and a cook to help her. One day, a sailor came into the restaurant, sat down at one of the tables, ordered what he wanted from the waitress, and then got up and left again after a few minutes. The owner of the restaurant was surprised when she saw this. So she called the waitress and asked her why the man had left before having his meal. Well, the waitress answered, "He asked for some of our fried rabbit, and when I went out into the kitchen to order it from the cook, the cat was just on the other side of the door, and I stopped on his tail by mistake. It made a terrible noise, of course, and then the man got up from his table and went out very quickly."